He could strike out an entire lineup, laugh at them on the walk back to the dugout, then wander out of the ballpark because he heard a fire bell in the distance. That was George Edward Rube Waddell, Hall of Fame lefty, human circus act, and maybe the most chaotic arm baseball has ever seen. Before he became a legend on major league mounds, he was a strange kid from rural Pennsylvania who seemed more interested in noise, animals, and trouble than anything resembling a normal life. He was born in 1876 near Bradford, Pennsylvania, into a working family tied to farms and the local oil fields. He grew up in the small town of Prospect, where there were more dirt roads than paved ones and more barns than brick buildings. From the start, people said he was different. At 3 years old, he supposedly wandered away from home, followed the sound of clanging bells, and ended up at the town fire station. He liked it so much he stayed there for days, sleeping around the engines and watching the volunteers rush out whenever an alarm rang. That early obsession with fire wagons never really left him. School barely registered. Teachers remembered a tall, distractible boy who showed up rarely, stared out the window often, and vanished completely once farm work and odd jobs started paying. His real education happened outdoors. On his family's land, he was sent to keep birds away from freshly planted fields. He did it by throwing rocks. Hour after hour, he whipped stones at crows and blackbirds until his left arm turned into a weapon. Neighbors later swore he could hit a bird out of a tree at ridiculous distances, long before anyone handed him a baseball. When he was not throwing at birds, he worked around mines and drilling rigs. Those jobs meant heavy tools, rough weather, and long days. By his teens, he had the thick forearms and broad shoulders of a grown laborer, wrapped around the attention span of a restless kid. Stories from Prospect describe him as friendly and loud, the kind of teenager who could toss hay bales like they were pillows, then wander off in the middle of a chore because something more interesting caught his eye. Baseball arrived in his life the way it did for a lot of boys then. Dusty pasture fields, chickens wandering across the outfield, and battered balls that had seen better days. Someone handed him the ball and told him to pitch. The first thing everyone noticed was the sound. The ball did not just arrive at the catcher. It hissed. Bats shattered. Hitters walked back to their wagons muttering that this farm kid was not normal. Local semi-pro clubs heard the rumors and started inviting him to pitch on weekends, paying him in small bills, meals, and free drinks. By the early 1890s, he was bouncing around western Pennsylvania, throwing for any team that could scrape together a few dollars and a uniform that halfway fit. Games were played on muddy diamonds ringed by rickety wooden bleachers. Coal smoke hung over the towns, and off in the distance drilling rigs clanked and groaned. On those fields, the legend of the big lefty began to grow. Newspapermen, always hungry for colorful copy, loved him. In 1896, papers in Titusville and Oil City started calling him Rube, a condescending nickname for a country bumpkin that stuck for the rest of his life. Even then, managers did not know what to do with him. One day, he would be untouchable, striking out batter after batter while the crowd roared on splintered benches. The next, he might simply fail to show up. If a carnival rolled into town, Rube might be found throwing balls at game booths or chatting with barkers. If a fire wagon clattered past, he would drop everything, sprint after it, and spend the evening hanging around the station. Controlling that arm was hard. Controlling the person attached to it was nearly impossible. His first true step into professional baseball came in 1897, when the Louisville Colonels in the National League signed him for $500. That was real money for a kid from the oil towns, and he reportedly blew a disturbing amount of it on drinking almost immediately. On paper, he was a rookie pitcher. In reality, he was still the same oversized teenager chasing whatever distracted him next. Louisville's ballpark was a far cry from the farm lots he was used to. But the basics were the same. Dusty infield, wooden grandstand, men in flat caps packed onto narrow benches, vendors shouting over the murmur of the crowd. When Rube stepped on the mound in that baggy early uniform wool, he looked both out of place and perfectly at home. He lost his debut, but reporters noticed that many of the hits against him came from future Hall of Famers, and that when he settled in, hitters looked miserable. The raw stuff was there. The question was whether anyone could keep him pointed in one direction long enough to use it. Coaches tried discipline. They fined him, benched him, and lectured him. It rarely worked. Stories from these early years sound like something between folklore and police reports. He once left in the middle of a game to go fishing because the stream beyond the outfield looked too inviting. Another time he walked off the mound to go play with a dog. A fan was holding up in the first row. Opposing crowds learned that if they brought puppies or shiny objects to the front of the stands, they might distract the visiting pitcher more effectively than any batter could. Off the field, the chaos continued. He disappeared for weeks and months between seasons. Eventually, people figured out that he was working for traveling carnivals, sometimes as a strongman, sometimes as an alligator wrestler in a circus act. There were tales of him sleeping in firehouses instead of team hotels, drinking away paychecks in crowded saloons, and charming reporters so completely that they happily wrote around his disappearances because the copy he gave them was too good to lose. Teams kept giving him chances because whenever he did show up on the mound, he could be spectacular. After Louisville, he bounced through Pittsburgh and Chicago, with managers alternately raving about his talent and tearing their hair out over his behavior. In cramped newspaper offices, typewriters clacked out box scores that made him look like two different men. One day, wild and ineffective. The next, double-digit strikeouts in an era when almost nobody struck out. If he was focused, he could call in his infielders, leave only the catcher behind the plate, and still fan the side, just to prove he did not need help. By the turn of the century, the game itself was changing. Ballparks were getting bigger, crowds louder, and newspapers more national. Owners wanted stars who could sell tickets, and they were starting to realize that Rube Waddell was not just a pitcher. He was an attraction. People paid to see what he might do, not just whether he would win. In the early 1900s, uniforms, with their high socks and simple block lettering, he paced those muddy diamonds like a restless showman, half ace, half sideshow. All the strange habits, distractions, and flashes of brilliance were moving him toward a larger stage. In 1902, when a tall, patient manager named Connie Mack brought him to the upstart Philadelphia Athletics, the sport finally had a big city. Big-time home ready for Rube Waddell's particular brand of chaos and dominance. Connie Mack thought he was bringing in a pitcher. What he really brought to Philadelphia was a traveling circus in a baggy uniform. When Rube Waddell joined the Athletics in 1902, the American League was still new, still trying to prove it belonged. Philadelphia's wooden ballpark shook on summer afternoons, packed with men in straw hats and kids pressed against the railings. Into that scene walked a tall, loose-limbed lefty who threw harder than almost anyone alive and behaved like no one the sport had ever seen. Once he settled under Mack's partial control, his dominance was ridiculous. From 1902 through 1907, Waddell led the American League in strikeouts 6 straight seasons, a run of power pitching nobody had seen before. In 1903, he fanned over 300 batters, then topped himself in 1904 with 349, a total that stood as a modern record for decades. Hitters were used to making contact. Against Waddell, they walked back to the dugout muttering, splinters in their bats and dust on their uniforms. He was not just racking up volume, he was winning at the highest level. In 1905, he pulled off the pitcher's triple crown, leading the league in wins, strikeouts, and earned run average, going 27-10 with a microscopic ERA around 1.5. That made 4 straight years with at least 20 victories. On the mound, he could be surgical, working the corners with a fastball that jumped and a curve that seemed to fall off a table at the plate. Connie Mack, not given to wild praise, later said Waddell had more stuff than any pitcher he ever saw. Games with Waddell became events. Early 1900s trains brought in fans from steel towns and river cities, pouring them into creaking grandstands. Vendors weaved through the aisles, newspapers rustled, and then the big lefty took the mound, wiping his hands on his wool pants. He liked to toy with crowds, smiling at hecklers, talking to batters, sometimes waving his infielders in close just to prove he didn't need them. On his best days, he struck out batters in clusters, piling Ks on the scoreboard and turning the afternoon into his own one-man show. The rest of his life did not match that control. Between starts, his path zigzagged through saloons, theater stages, and side jobs that felt more like dares. One off-season, he toured in a melodrama, tossing the villain across the stage to roaring crowds. Another report had him wrestling alligators for a circus. At various points, he tended bar, lived in firehouses, and somehow still showed up each spring throwing bullets. Writers loved him because the copy wrote itself. Box scores told one story. The datelines told another. His distractions followed him into the ballpark. The old stories say fire engines were his kryptonite. If a fire alarm clanged in the streets beyond the outfield wall, Rube might suddenly perk up, drop his glove, and bolt toward the sound, leaving teammates and umpires shouting after him while the crowd buzzed in confusion. More than once, he wandered off mid-game to chase a fire wagon rumbling down a cobblestone road. Sirens and bells calling to the same kid who had slept in a firehouse years before. Fans caught on. They began bringing puppies to the front rail, holding them up as the big lefty worked. He would see a wriggling dog, grin, and trot over between batters to scratch its ears. Others flashed shiny objects, knowing that glinting metal could put him in a kind of trance. Opponents did not need elaborate scouting reports. They just needed distractions and patience. Still, even with all that, many days they walked back to the dugout having barely touched the ball. Teammates' feelings were mixed. Some adored him, treated him like a brilliant, out-of-control younger brother. Others resented the special treatment and constant drama. One catcher famously insisted on a contract clause saying he would no longer room with Waddell unless he agreed to stop eating crackers in bed. Cross-country train rides could turn into tense rolling cages. One fight over a straw hat reportedly turned into a full brawl, further convincing Mac that even his ace might be more trouble than he was worth. Newspapers, for their part, could not get enough. The sports pages splashed his name in bold type across grainy photos of him in athletics flannels. Headlines swung between praise and exasperation, celebrating another double-digit strikeout performance one day, then chiding his vanishing acts or barroom escapades the next. In a young league fighting for attention, he was a godsend. Fans who barely understood the standings still recognized the lanky left-hander who might save a game, start a fire, or star in a play. By the late 1900s, the edges started to fray. Heavy drinking, mounting injuries, and chaotic personal relationships took their toll. His behavior grew harder for teammates to ignore. Mac, always calculating, finally decided he could not keep sacrificing clubhouse stability, even for a generational arm. Before the 1908 season, the Athletics sent Waddell to the St. Louis Browns. On paper, it was just a transaction. In reality, it marked the beginning of the end. In St. Louis, he still flashed brilliance. He once struck out 16 batters in a single game, a record at the time, but he also reportedly passed out drunk mid-game and showed up less and less as the seasons wore on. By 1910, the Browns released him. The man who had dominated the American League was now bouncing down the ladder into the minors, pitching for teams in places like Minneapolis and small Northern League towns. On worn-down fields in front of modest crowds, he still pulled stunts like catching a return, throw behind his back before fanning the final batter of his last professional game. His final act had nothing to do with a box score. In 1912, severe flooding hit Hickman, Kentucky, swelling the Mississippi and threatening to wipe out the town. Waddell, in spring training nearby, spent hours in icy floodwater, helping stack sandbags and hold back the river. He did it again when more floodwaters came later. The cold soaked him to the bone. He developed pneumonia that never fully cleared, then tuberculosis. Sent to live with his sister in Texas, he dwindled in a sanitarium outside San Antonio. The hospital room's a world away from roaring ballparks and carnival lights. He died there in 1914 at just 37 years old. Baseball eventually caught up to the memory. In 1946, the Hall of Fame enshrined him, recognizing that his dominance and drawing power outweighed the chaos that shortened his career. Modern writers look back and see hints of conditions no one understood at the time, along with the obvious wreckage of alcoholism. They also see a pitcher whose strikeout record stood for decades and whose stories still sound like fiction. Rube Waddell's life feels like a storm that briefly parked itself over early baseball. Talent flashed like lightning. Managers tried to bottle it and failed. One moment he was the best pitcher on earth, framed against packed wooden bleachers and headline ink. The next he was gone, chasing a fire truck, a dog, a river, or his own impulses. In the end, his legend looks less like a straight career line and more like a wild pitch. Unpredictable, hard to control, but unforgettable once you have seen it leave the hand. That is how some geniuses are remembered. Not as tidy stat sheets, but as stories people keep retelling long after the last pitch has faded into the dark.